All right, so in our last section of notes, we talked a great deal about factory work. We talked about child labor and how dangerous it was for children to be working in these factories. We talked about how long the hours were, and we also talked a little bit about the workers not being paid very much for their work. So today, we are going to talk about how in the late 1800s, workers decide to organize labor unions to improve their wages and working conditions. All right, so how are the workers exploited by big business? So the average laborer worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Men often work 7 days a week. They receive no benefits, so they're not provided vacation time or sick leave, unemployment compensation, or injury benefits. So as a teacher here at Felicity, I get obviously 3 months off in the summer. I get 3 personal days. I get sick leave. I get 3 weeks worth of sick leave if I need it. And then I'm paid for those days. And then as far as injury, if I'm injured at work, then that can be paid for as well. These things were not available to workers in the late 1800s. So in 1882, there were 675 factory workers killed each week because of the dangerous working conditions. And we'll be talking a lot more about some of the working conditions that these people were dealing with. Okay, so how are women and children treated in industry? Wages are very low for men, but even more so for women and children. However, in order to make ends meet, women and children had to work. 20% of children under 12 work full-time. The youngest full-time employee is only 4. Children earn an average of 0.02 an hour, and women earn half as much as their male counterparts. All right, so what is the workers' response to labor exploitation? As labor unions emerge, they come to represent the first multi-gender, multiracial, multi-class organizations in the U.S. One of the very first organizations that we see is the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. This was founded by Samuel Gompers and forms after the Knights of Labor that we'll talk about here in just a second. This was a craft union, and only skilled workers were allowed to join. Samuel Gompers, within the AFL, he would use strikers to win higher wages and shorter work weeks. He also used collective bargaining, which is when workers negotiate as a group and not as individuals. An example of collective bargaining would be a few years back, maybe even closer to 5 years back, the NFL. They were trying to work out a deal with the owners of their football teams. And they were trying to basically get a shorter season. They felt like they had to play too many games within that season. I think they also wanted additional pay. And so they were trying to work out these deals with their owners, and that's called collective bargaining, when you as a group, and this was several football players, decided to kind of go on strike and refuse to play until the owners kind of met their demands. And for a while there, we didn't know if we were going to have a football season because it didn't seem like they were going to be able to reach any sort of agreement. And luckily they do eventually meet an agreement, and we had an NFL season that year, and I'll have to look up what year that was, but extra credit for anybody who looks that up and lets me know what year that was. Yeah, so Samuel Gompers, very successful at, again, using strikes and also using collective bargaining to kind of make his point and get his workers' demands met. Okay, Our next union was the International Workers of the World, or the Wobblies. They did not like the AFL and focused on unskilled workers. They didn't like the AFL because it did not allow unskilled workers to join. Many radical socialists were the group's leaders, and many of their strikes were extremely violent. Their leader was Eugene V. Debs, and he believed, and this is something he actually said, a quote coming from him, "The strike is the weapon of the oppressed." He also started the American Railway Union and led the Pullman strike. And 5 times the candidate of the Socialist Party of America for President of the United States. And believe it or not, he lost all 5 times, poor guy. The next one here is the Knights of Labor. This formed in Philadelphia. Membership was open to all people. This included African Americans and women, skilled and unskilled. So we would see farmers, factory workers, shopkeepers, and office workers, all members of the Knights of Labor. Their goal was they wanted equal pay for equal work, as well as an 8-hour workday, and to see child labor ended. They didn't like strikes, but that is how they achieved most of their power. After a few bad strikes, however, with some of those becoming very violent, they lost a lot of their members, and power, they came to believe, was an injury to one, is a concern for all. I also want to point out that the very first large-scale union that had over 600,000 members was the National Labor Union, and they got Congress to legalize an 8-hour workday for government workers, and that's going to be before any of the other labor unions that we discussed here. All right, so what movement branches off of labor unions? And we talked a little bit about this in a previous slide, but this is going to be socialism. And the exploitation of the workers and the accumulation of the wealth by the rich causes tension. And again, we start to see that divide between the rich and the poor. Eugene Debs and the International Workers of the World, IWW, pushed for National Socialism. Now remember, socialism is an economic and political philosophy that favors public instead of private control of the means of production. And it's on that scale moving towards communism. So it's just in a less extreme version of communism where everything is publicly owned. There's no private property and with communism. And so socialism, again, it's going to be some private but mostly public economic and political philosophy. An example of socialism, again, and I gave this to you, I think, in a previous set of notes, would be if you had 2 cows, the government would take both cows, put them in a barn with everyone else's cows, and then give you as much milk as they think you need. So they kind of decide for you, and those cows become public ownership, not private ownership. Socialists believe that society at large, not just private individuals, should take charge of the nation's wealth. The wealth then should be distributed equally to everyone. And socialists believe that when it comes to business, we should operate, not compete. And most Americans oppose socialism. And we talked about this also in the last of notes, that almost all of the groups of people, politicians, the wealthy, the poor, opposed socialism across the board. Now, the poor, you would think, would be in favor of spreading the wealth around evenly, but they actually were not, and that was because they believed in capitalism. They believed in you working hard for your money. And with socialism system, you can work really, really, really hard, but you're going to make the same amount of money as the person next to you. And so it really took away that that idea of capitalism that America was founded on. Also understand that socialism was an idea which brought the working poor equality. However, most didn't see it that way. The extravagant lifestyles of the rich and the business owners, they help create this large financial gap between the haves and the have-nots, or the rich and the poor. And they believed, the socialists, that public should be in control of the nation's wealth and not individuals, and that wealth should be spread out, distributed equally to everyone. All right, so with workers fighting for their rights, some turn to socialism. Not all, some. All right, so what occurred due to the new socialist outlook? Strikes. So when workers voluntarily refuse to work, this is known as a strike. Strikes become violent at times. So some examples of this would be the Haymarket Square, where 1,200 protests in Chicago for an 8-hour workday in 1886. Another example would be the Homestead Strike. Henry Frick, he tried to cut wages at Carnegie Steel. Scabs, which were known as replacement workers, are used for the first time during this strike. And the union lost support when it turned violent. And then the Pullman strike. President Cleveland ends the strike. He ends up jailing Debs and has all the strikers fired. So again, the Pullman strike, with this particular incident, wages were cut by 25%, and some workers were even laid off. They also felt that Pullman, the owner, exercised way too much control over the workers in the town that he had built for them. So he kind of had control over their life because he owned everything. So, for example, he could ban alcohol. He could set food prices, and rent prices could be set at whatever price he wanted them to be set at. And so they felt like he just had too much control over their lives. The Pullman strike was a boycott of Pullman railway cars. And again, President Cleveland puts down the strike, jails Debs, which was the leader of the strike, and has all of the strikers fired. Understand that none of the above strikes were successful, and many were injured, and even some killed during these strikes. We will talk more about each one of these in a assignment later on. So what was America's reaction to the strikes? Public opinion turns against the laborers after violence erupts. Many people do not want to be a part of a labor union once it goes violent. Companies began to forbid union activities. Employees are forced to sign yellow dog contracts. Basically, with these contracts, they had to promise to never join a union or participate in a strike. And employers also forbade union meets and fired union organizers. Organizing becomes very difficult then at this point because it's losing membership, and because of these barriers that those owners are putting in place, and the government essentially is kind of getting on the side of the owners because they kind of see it as the people coming together as a monopoly. They see labor unions as kind of forming a monopoly. So, in addition, laws are passed limiting union activity, and the fear of socialism leads to the loss of favor.